In 1943, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization published its first global assessment of protein security, a document that mapped how different regions of the world fed their populations in the absence of industrial livestock systems. This report shaped international agricultural policy for decades, defining what crops deserved investment, research funding, and institutional support. But one detail in that assessment was systematically erased from the conversation that followed. A detail about a plant that had fed billions of people for thousands of years, while simultaneously making their soil more fertile with every harvest. A plant that required almost nothing from farmers and gave back everything. The FAO's list of protein-rich crops included the expected entries: soybeans in their newly mechanized American fields, lentils in their Middle Eastern birthplace, chickpeas spreading across Mediterranean terraces, and dry beans being packaged for global distribution. But there was one crop that didn't appear where you'd expect to find it, listed among the staples that deserved immediate modernization and industrial scaling. Instead, it appeared in a different section entirely, one reserved for crops described as regionally significant but agronomically problematic, a category that translation reveals meant something very specific: crops that worked too well outside the system being built. That crop was Cajanus cajan, known across most of the world by a name that captures its dual nature: the pigeon pea, the soil-feeding protein. And for more than 3,500 years, it defined how tropical and subtropical populations maintained fertility in their fields while extracting dense nutrition from the same ground, generation after generation, without the soil ever depleting, without external inputs ever becoming necessary, without dependence on any supply chain except the one farmers controlled themselves by saving seeds from each harvest and planting them the following season or the season after that, whenever conditions seemed right. The earliest agricultural texts from the Indian subcontinent, dating back millennia before European contact, reference pigeon pea cultivation more frequently than they reference rice in certain regions, describing it not as a supplementary crop, but as foundational to the agricultural calendar. Monastery records from medieval India show pigeon pea planted in temple grounds across climatic zones, from coastal humidity to interior drought, adapting without intervention. Ancient Ayurvedic texts classified it not merely as food, but as medicine, assigning it properties that modern nutritional analysis has confirmed: complete amino acid profiles, micronutrient density, and digestive benefits that made it central to daily consumption. In East Africa, where it arrived through Indian Ocean trade routes, oral histories describe it as the plant that pays twice, once when you eat it and once when the next crop grows stronger in the same soil. Across the Caribbean, enslaved populations who had no choice about what they grew or ate nonetheless chose to cultivate pigeon pea in every small plot they could control, which tells you something about how they valued it when nothing else was voluntary. And then, beginning in the 1960s, it disappeared from agricultural development priorities across the global south. Not because of disease, not because of pest pressure, not because farmers stopped wanting it, but because it was systematically excluded from the Green Revolution's portfolio of crops deemed worthy of improvement, investment, and institutional support. National governments that had relied on pigeon pea for centuries began redirecting research funding toward annual grains that required fertilizer packages, hybrid seeds that couldn't be saved, and pest management systems that demanded chemical inputs. And within a single generation, millions of hectares that had grown pigeon pea continuously for longer than written records existed were converted to crops that exhausted the soil, required continuous external inputs, and produced inferior protein per unit of land, while generating vastly superior returns for the companies selling what farmers now had to buy every single season. This isn't a story about taste, or even about nutrition, although both matter here. This is a story about business model compatibility, about how an entire agricultural system was reorganized around a simple economic principle. Crops that allow farmers to be self-sufficient represent a design flaw, not a feature. The global agricultural input industry, which today generates over $330 billion annually, needed populations to forget that pigeon pea existed, because pigeon pea removes the recurring revenue stream that makes modern agribusiness function. You can't sell someone nitrogen fertilizer when their field is manufacturing nitrogen for free. You can't sell them new seeds every year when they're saving seeds that perform identically to what they'd buy. You can't sell them pest management systems when the crop tolerates stress so well that intervention rarely becomes necessary. Pigeon pea wasn't excluded from the Green Revolution because it didn't work. It was excluded because it worked in ways that eliminated the need for what was being sold. The document that makes this undeniable was published in 1979 by the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics, an institution created specifically to study crops like pigeon pea that thrived in conditions where wheat and rice failed. The lead researcher, after decades of field trials across India, wrote a single sentence in the conclusion that agricultural ministries apparently decided to ignore. Pigeon pea's primary limitation is not agronomic performance, but its incompatibility with centralized supply chain management and mechanical harvesting systems designed for uniform annual crops. Read that again. The defect wasn't that it grew poorly. The defect was that it didn't cooperate with industrial agriculture's logistical requirements. It was too good at things that didn't generate profit for anyone except the farmer. Here's what pigeon pea actually does, and why those characteristics created a business problem disguised as an agricultural one. A single planting produces harvestable protein for 2 to 5 years without replanting, which means 4 years of production that generate zero seed sales. It fixes atmospheric nitrogen through root nodules at rates exceeding 100 kilograms per hectare annually, which means it fertilizes itself and everything planted near it, eliminating the nitrogen fertilizer market entirely for that field. It grows in soils so poor that extension agents classify them as agriculturally marginal, tolerating pH ranges from 4.5 to 8.4, and thriving in conditions that would kill soybeans before they flowered, which means it doesn't require soil amendments or lime applications. It withstands months-long droughts by developing taproots that reach 3 meters deep, accessing water reserves that annual crops never touch, which means it doesn't require irrigation infrastructure or the energy costs associated with pumping. It produces pods continuously over a 4-month harvest window rather than ripening all at once, which means families can eat fresh protein daily instead of harvesting, drying, and storing a single large batch, but also means it can't be harvested with combine equipment designed for synchronized maturity. And the protein content sits at 23% with amino acid profiles that complement rice, maize, and cassava perfectly, providing complete nutrition when combined with staples that millions of people already ate, which means populations didn't need to change their diets or adopt unfamiliar foods to solve protein deficiency. Meanwhile, soybeans, the crop that consumed the research funding and institutional support that might have gone to pigeon pea, were being systematically bred for characteristics that had nothing to do with nutrition or farmer benefit, and everything to do with supply chain compatibility. Plant breeders selected for uniform height so that mechanical harvesters could cut every plant at the same level without leaving pods behind. They selected for synchronized pod maturity so that entire fields could be harvested in a single pass, reducing labor costs for large operators, but eliminating the continuous harvest that had fed families daily. They selected for determinate growth habits that stopped the plant's development at a genetically programmed point, making yields predictable for commodity traders, but removing the plant's ability to compensate for early season stress by growing longer. They selected for seeds that were larger, smoother, and easier to clean with industrial equipment, not because those traits improved nutrition, but because they reduced processing costs at centralized facilities. And they selected for plants that responded dramatically to nitrogen fertilizer, not because farmers needed higher yields per se, but because creating fertilizer-responsive varieties guaranteed that peak performance required purchased inputs, converting what had been a self-sufficient system into one that generated revenue at every step. None of this was about feeding people better. It was about designing crops that required infrastructure, required inputs, and required farmers to participate in markets they'd previously operated outside of. There's an invisible rule governing what appears in supermarkets and what gets distributed through institutional food systems. A rule that has nothing to do with nutrition or taste and everything to do with logistics. Modern food distribution demands crops that look identical, ripen on schedule, survive transportation without damage, and can be stored for months without quality loss. Pigeon pea violates every single one of these requirements, not because it's inferior, but because it evolved to serve a completely different purpose. It produces pods at different times, which means you can't harvest an entire field in one day. It grows to varying heights, depending on local conditions, which means mechanical harvesting becomes inefficient. Its seeds come in multiple colors and sizes, even within a single variety, which means it fails the cosmetic uniformity standards that supermarkets enforce. And it's best consumed fresh or dried immediately after harvest, which means it doesn't sit well in warehouses waiting for distribution schedules to align. Pigeon pea doesn't cooperate with the system because the system was designed around its absence. It grew in the rhythms that soil and weather dictated, not in the rhythms that quarterly earnings reports required. But there's a problem deeper than logistics, deeper than mechanization, deeper than cosmetic uniformity, and it's the problem that actually explains why pigeon pea was pushed to the margins while inferior crops received billions in development funding. Pigeon pea doesn't require you to buy it again. It removes recurring revenue from the equation entirely, and in way, an agricultural economy built on annual transactions. That's not a feature, that's a failure of business model design. Watch how this works in practice. You plant soybeans, you harvest them, the plant dies, and next year you need new seeds whether you saved your own or not, because hybrid vigor declines and patent restrictions often forbid replanting anyway, which means the seed company gets paid annually. You plant pigeon pea, you harvest it, the plant keeps growing, and for the next 2 to 5 years you harvest again without buying anything, which means the seed company's revenue from your field drops to zero after the first transaction. You grow corn, your soil depletes nitrogen, and you purchase fertilizer to restore it, creating an annual input cost that compounds as soil health declines and fertilizer requirements increase, which means the input supplier gets paid every season with escalating amounts. You grow pigeon pea, your soil gains nitrogen, and the longer you grow it, the less you need to buy, because the plant is manufacturing fertility in real time, which means the fertilizer company's market share in your region shrinks towards zero. This isn't about whether pigeon pea works. This is about pigeon pea working in ways that eliminate the transactions modern agriculture depends on. Today, the global market for agricultural inputs, including seeds, fertilizers, and crop protection chemicals, exceeds $330 billion annually, and the overwhelming majority of that revenue depends on crops that require repurchasing every year. Soybeans alone account for seed sales worth over $8 billion, with associated fertilizer and chemical inputs adding tens of billions more. The entire system is optimized around crops that die after one season, that deplete soil rather than building it, and that require external inputs to perform at acceptable levels. There's an entire financial ecosystem built on this model, including futures markets, commodity trading, input financing, and corporate research budgets that wouldn't exist if farmers grew crops that fed themselves and their soil simultaneously without requiring annual purchases. Pigeon pea represents a structural threat to that ecosystem, not because it's radical or untested, but because it's exactly what agriculture looked like before it was reorganized around recurring revenue streams. In the earliest agricultural texts that document pigeon pea cultivation, it appears as the standard, the crop against which others were compared for protein content, soil improvement, and drought tolerance. In modern agricultural literature, it appears as an alternative, a niche crop, or a subsistence option, language that positions what was once foundational as now supplementary, what was once sophisticated as now primitive, what was once the intelligent choice as now the fallback for those who can't afford better. The original became the substitute. The perennial became the alternative to annuals that hadn't existed when pigeon pea was domesticated. The crop that built soil became the primitive version of crops that mine it. This linguistic reversal wasn't accidental. It was necessary to reposition what worked outside the industrial model as inferior to what worked within it, even when objective metrics, yields per input cost, nutrition per hectare, soil health over time, showed the opposite. If you can redefine normal, you can make self-sufficiency look like poverty and dependence look like progress. The institutional priorities shifted. The research funding dried up. The development agencies moved on. But pigeon pea still grows in the courtyards of Indian villages that never stopped planting it, in the hillside gardens of Caribbean families whose grandparents recognized what mattered, in the intercropped fields of East African farmers who understand that next year's soil fertility is this year's strategic decision, in the forgotten corners of botanical gardens, where it volunteers from seeds dropped decades ago by researchers who studied it before the funding disappeared. The system changed. The policies shifted, the markets reorganized, but the plant that has fed billions while simultaneously building the ground beneath their feet for 3.5 millennia continues growing wherever someone recognizes that soil and food aren't separate. Problems requiring separate solutions, but the same problem requiring the same plant, and that recognition persists because perennials outlast institutional amnesia. Bringing this back into your system is simpler than the decades of its exclusion would suggest. You can acquire pigeon pea seeds for under $15, sometimes less than $5 depending on variety and source, From specialty seed companies that maintain genetic diversity the mainstream market abandoned. Plant them after your last frost date in soil that doesn't need to be perfect, just well drained enough to prevent root rot, spacing them 2 to 3 feet apart because they'll grow larger than you expect. First year, expect establishment, root development reaching deep into subsoil layers, and a modest harvest that mostly teaches you how the plant behaves in your specific conditions. Second year and beyond, expect continuous production from the same plants. Expect your soil's nitrogen levels to rise measurably if you test them. Expect nearby crops to perform better than they did before pigeon pea arrived, and expect to save seeds from your own harvest for expansion or sharing, because that's how this crop traveled across continents for millennia before seed patents existed. You're not adopting an experimental technique. You're recovering a tested system that was deliberately replaced not because it failed, but because it succeeded in ways that removed your dependence on supply chains designed to keep you purchasing. If this changed how you see beans, those rows of uniform kidney beans and navy beans and pinto beans in the supermarket that die after one season and leave your soil poorer than they found it, then you're starting to recognize something larger. You're not buying food when you purchase those beans. You're buying a system that requires you to keep buying. You're not choosing crops when you plant annuals that demand fertilizer. You're choosing a relationship with suppliers who profit from your soil's depletion. And if a single plant, pigeon pea, can simultaneously produce protein for years, manufacture its own nitrogen, improve everything planted nearby, and require almost nothing except space and time, then the question isn't why it works. The question is why you weren't told it existed, and what that absence reveals about whose interest agricultural development actually serves. Subscribe to the Power Roots. We're excavating the crops, the techniques, and the systems that were removed from agriculture, not because they failed to feed people, but because they succeeded in ways that threatened supply chains optimized for extraction rather than sustainability. The next vault opens soon, and what's inside it will change how you understand where food actually comes from when the system isn't designed to make you forget.